Okay, so for this practical exam, we need to be able to set up FK and IK joint chains. The FK, meaning forward kinematics, will be used for the spine and neck. IK, or inverse kinematics, will be used for the legs. You then need to be able to set up control curves at the appropriate place and create parent-child and constraint relationships to bring everything together so that you can control the geometry with the joints and the joints with the curves. You'll be animating on the curves then to animate a basic side step. Now the geometry that I end up giving you in the exam itself will be slightly different than this, but the overall concepts that I'll go over right now are similar. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in Maya and set up this rig. Now I've gone ahead and created this geometry group, which is what you'll receive, essentially a group of geometry that resembles something like this. So a torso, head, and legs. And the first step, if you remember, is to set up those joint chains. So let's do that. Now whenever I set up joints, I want to make sure I'm in one of the orthographic views. So I've hit spacebar to toggle between the 4 viewport view and then the single viewport. If I put my cursor over the viewport I want and hit the spacebar, it will then maximize that particular viewport. I'll then select my geometry group and hit F, and that will center all of everything that I just had selected in the viewport. All right, so to create joints again, I go to the rigging menu, and I'm going to go ahead and switch over to the rigging menu set as well up here in the top left. I can then click on the create joints tool. Now this is also available under skeleton and create joints. So either way is a good way to access that tool. I'm then going to place a joint right here in the center of the mesh around where the hips are. So right about here. I want to be able to see them, so I'm going to turn on shading X-ray joints in my viewport, and that is specific to the camera that I'm using. So if you're using the side camera or the perspective camera, you need to turn it on in whatever camera you want to use. So then I'm going to go ahead and set up a joint here in the middle for the spine, one right here for the chest, and then one just right here for the head, just at the base of the head, and hit return. I'm then going to make sure that's centered by selecting that hip joint and then holding down X and moving that over so that's directly on the center. I'm then going to check my side view by, again, turning on X-ray joints in the side view and making sure that's centered, which it is. So that's good to go. That is my initial spine and neck joint chain. If I hold down Shift and click on the plus next to joint, it will expand all the joints in that chain. I want to go now and rename those. So the first one's the hip joint. The second one's the spine joint. I then have the chest joint. And I'm just going to call this the neck joint. So typically we'd have either a neck and a head joint, so neck and head joint here. For this, it'll just be one. So in this case, he doesn't really have a neck, but that will be the joint at where the neck is on this character. And so that is set up. That is an FK spine chain. By default, it's an FK joint chain because that's how it works. So forward kinematics means that I can rotate these around directly, or if I have controls attached to them and I rotate the controls, the joints will rotate. And it will go up the chain from the top of the chain, which in this case is the hip, not the physical top, but the top in the hierarchy down through the bottom of the chain. So that is set up that way. Now I want to go in and create my leg joints. So I'm going to grab my Create Joints tool again and set up a joint chain running through from the thigh down to the knee and then to the area where the foot would be. In this case, it's just a stub. I'll then check that in my side view to make sure that's where I want it to be. In this case, I want that to be kind of centered on the sphere because it'll rotate a little bit more smoothly that way. And I again with this as well. And this one can be just down at the bottom. So I'm just snapping those to the location I want them in. And then in the front view, I'm going to do the same thing. Grab that top one. And now I just need to snap the top one because I want that to stay in a straight chain. And that should stay centered because of the way the geometry is set up. Now all the joints are centered in the front view as well. So I've checked that in both views and that looks good. Let's again hit Shift and expand all the joints in that chain. Shift to click on the plus sign to expand everything below it to expand the entire hierarchy. This is going to be L underscore thigh joint, L underscore knee joint, and L underscore ankle joint. And this is sort of a hybrid ankle foot joint in this case. I'm going to just call it the ankle joint because that's ankle joint because that's where it rests in the body, and I'm going to be attaching the IK chain from the thigh to the ankle, so it makes it a little bit easier if I just set it up that way. Okay, now I'd like to mirror this over, so I'll go again to the skeleton menu, mirror joints, and pull up the option box. Now if you have default set, it's going to say mirror across XY, mirror the function as the behavior, and then search for is blank. We want this to be YZ mirrored, so it actually mirrors across the x-axis. And then I want to search for L underscore, which is the left leg prefix, and replace it with R underscore, so it's the right leg prefix. Go ahead and mirror that. And that joint chain's now set up, and it should be in the same spot since I set up this model to be directly centered on the x-axis. So 0, 0, or 0 on the x-axis, which is nice because then I can mirror things across the axis. So don't move the geometry around. I will try to go ahead and do that same thing when I'm setting up your geometry for this practical exam. All right, so that's set up. I now want to set up the IK handles that go on the legs. So let's switch over, grab my left knee, rotate it back the way that it should be rotating if it were bending naturally. Go up to skeleton, and then set the preferred angle. This will tell the IK chain what way to bend the leg. I'm going to go into my channel box and zero out that rotation value on there. Grab my other leg and do the same thing. So I'm going to rotate it back the way that it naturally would bend. Go to skeleton, set preferred angle, and zero out. Okay, so I'm not undoing, I'm just zeroing out that rotate Y value. If I undo, then it will undo the set preferred angle as well. So make sure you're zeroing it out, the rotation value, not undoing the rotation with Control Z. All right, so let's center everything again. So I have all the joints that I need for this set up now. Now I need to set up those IK handles. So in my outliner, I'm going to grab this geometry group, go to my channel box, and down here in the layers, I'm going to create a layer from selected and then reference it. So now I'm not going to have issues accidentally selecting geometry when I'm meaning to do stuff to the joints. And I'll unreference this a little bit later on. It may be helpful to name this though. I double clicked on the layer name. And so I'll just rename that to geo_layer to indicate that it's the geometry. All right, so what do I do now? I need to switch back over to my front view. Now grab the IK handle tool or create IK handle tool, and I can do that up here in the skeleton menu or the down here on the rigging menu set. I'll double click on that to pull up my tool settings. If I reset this tool, it should default to rotate plane solver, which is what we want, an RP solver. And then I want to check sticky over here in these in this set of checkboxes. It needs to be sticky. To create the IK handle, I start at the top of the chain, which is the thigh. Click on that, and then click on the bottom of the chain, which is the ankle. And that creates that one IK handle. I'll go over here, rename this to left_foot IK handle. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the right side. Click on the thigh, click on the ankle, rename to right foot IK handle. And these names are not redundant. They help out in knowing what things are, so use the same naming format. Otherwise, it's going to take, if I need to troubleshoot something to figure out what you did wrong when I'm grading, it's much easier if you just use the same naming format. And this convention is fairly intuitive, and so it shouldn't be an issue. Naming things, again, you have if it's a right or left, you put the R_L_ at the beginning. You have the name of whatever the object is that you're naming, and then the type goes on the end as a suffix. So on this JNT represents joint. If I look under the geometry group, they all have geo at the end to tell me that's geometry, and it keeps things clean. If I have a hip joint and hip geometry, I now am able to distinguish both of those by name, so they aren't just both hip. So that's why I add that little suffix on, and I have those prefix on as well. So use this same naming convention, and it should be easier for me to then look at it and troubleshoot anything that you have done incorrectly or accidentally messed up on. Okay, that's the joint setup. I'll go ahead and check to make sure that this works by grabbing both of these thigh joints and putting them underneath the hip joint, directly underneath the hip joint. Now if I select the hip joint, it selects everything. But if the IK handles are set up properly, then when I move this, and I'll turn on the X-ray joints in this too. When I move this down, the feet stay planted in place. If I do it incorrectly, then I may have some issues with the legs bending incorrectly, in which case I'll have to redo the IK handles, or with just the legs going straight through. So leave these IK handles outside this joint chain to begin with, because they are going to go underneath the foot controls, not underneath the joints. So right now I have separate groups for the geometry. I have this joint, everything underneath the hip joint for the joints, and then these IK handles are separate because they're going to go underneath the controls. So let's go ahead and start setting things up. The first main control that I need, and I'll go ahead and click under the curved surfaces menu shelf, the curved shelf here at the top. I can also go to create NURBS primitives and circle if I want to. I noticed that some of you are missing your shelves. You can access it either through the menu or through the shelves. All right, so let's create a circle to begin with. I'm going to scale this up so that it's a nice size circle around the character's feet, and name this the root anim. I'll then create a circle over here that I'm going to snap to that foot joint, that ankle joint rather, and Call that the left foot anim. I'm going to duplicate that and throw that onto the other side. And call this one the R underscore foot anim, so the right foot anim. Then going to create, I'll scale this up first, but then I'll create one for the hips. And these are all just, and you may want to, during this stage, go ahead and turn off the visibility on the geometry. So turn it on and off, so make sure that I'm snapping directly to joints and not to geometry. So I'll call this one the hip underscore anim. I'll go ahead and duplicate this, snap this up, and call this one the spine underscore anim. Duplicate it, V snap it up, so I'm holding down V to snap to vertices, in this case joints, and call this one the chest underscore anim. That didn't quite work. Okay, there we go. Okay, and then one last time, I'll go ahead and duplicate this. Hold down D and V to access the, sorry, just hold down V. I'll just snap this directly up to the neck joint and then scale this down a little bit. Okay. Now I may want to change the size of these a little bit so that if I'm looking at it from the top view, it's easier to tell which is which. So I've scaled down the chest and the spine so they're a little bit, so looking at it from this top view, they are not all the same size. And I'll scale the hips up a little bit even more just so that to differentiate them. Okay. So all those controls are set up properly. Now I need to grab all these controls. I'll just, let's see. This is the neck anim control. Make sure they're all named properly. I'm going to grab all my controls before I start parenting or creating relationships and go to Modify, Freeze Transformations, Edit, Delete by Type, History. Okay. So let's start setting up the parenting in the controls. The neck goes under the chest goes under the spine goes under the hips and the feet both go under the root. Before I do that though, I'm going to grab this right foot IK handle, middle mouse click and drag it under the right foot anim. The left foot IK handle, I will middle mouse drag under the left foot anim. Now I'm doing this in the outliner, so if you don't remember where that is, if you don't have it up already, Windows Outliner pulls up this box typically as a separate panel. I've docked it over here on the right. And so both of these foot anims now go underneath the root anim. I'm going to go ahead and just shift click on the plus next to root anim to expand everything. And then I'll do the same thing for the hips and the geometry. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to set up is the control. I want the controls to control the joints. And to do this, I'm going to use parent constraints. So I'm going to select the control and then either shift click on the joint in the viewport or control click on the joint in the outliner and then go to constrain parent. So I've now just parented the hip joint to the hip anim. So remember, always select the boss first, then the subordinate. So spine anim first, then spine joint, constrain parent. Chest anim, chest joint, constrain parent. Neck anim, neck joint, constrain parent. So that sets up my FK joint chains. So if I were to test this out, fingers crossed, it should work. So let's rotate this around to make sure that that looks good. It looks great. And each of these as well. And then this one. Okay, that looks good. Okay, and then with the foot anim, they actually are now controlling the IK handles, so they should also be controlling the legs already. So without doing too much work, we were able to set up those legs. All right. So let's now attach the geometry to the joints. So we're going to do the same type of thing we just did with the controls, but with the joints and the geometry. So I'm going to select hip joint, hip geo, control, constrain, parent. Okay, spine joint. In this case, I called it stomach. Geo, constrain, parent. Chest joint, chest geo, constrain, parent. Neck joint, head geo, constrain, and parent. So in a more complex mesh, we're not going to be constraining these. We'll be skinning the geometry to the joints. But since this is a really basic character, basic geometry, we don't need to do that. Okay, we can just constrain it. I'm trying to simplify things a little bit for you. You've gone through the skinning process once, so I don't want to necessarily have to do that again. Okay, so left thigh joint, left thigh geo, constrain parent, left knee, left calf geo, constrain parent. And the ankle joint doesn't have any geometry associated with it, so we won't constrain anything to that. Right thigh joint, and then right thigh geo, constrain parent. Right knee joint, right calf geo, constrain parent. Okay. So let's try this out. Let's see if I did it correctly. If not, then we can troubleshoot. I go down, and everything seems to be moving correctly. Let's try out the controls once more. I'm going to move the hips, the spine, the chest, and the neck. Okay, that all looks good. I'll go ahead and move the foot around to see if that works, and that looks great. Okay, now I'm going to turn everything off now because I want to do my animation. Select all my curves. Make sure that my animation auto keyframe toggle is on, so it's highlighted in blue. And then once I have all my curves selected, let's go ahead and clean these things up a little bit. So first off, I have my controls underneath the root anim, but not the geometry. So let's select both of those, the joint group, the joint chain, and the geometry group, and throw those under the root control. So now everything's under the root control. This big circle at the bottom, this main control. This is not what I'm going to animate though. I want to animate everything else though, so I'm going to shift click off the root control. So everything else should be selected. If I shift click here, you'll see that all those controls at the top, I'm going to minimize these two, but if you look at all these controls, they are all selected, which is what I want. I'm going to set a key there. I'm going to go forward to about frame 32. Let's see. Let's make it 36. Go forward to frame 36. Well, I think in the class I did 32, so we'll keep it at that. Go ahead and set a key there as well. And then go about halfway in between, which is frame 16. And let's get rid of this key for now. I'm going to right click and get rid of it. Set one and set it at frame 16. Now at this frame, I've selected everything and hit S to key everything at this frame. So on this frame though, I want my character to sidestep. So I'm going to grab the hips in the left leg and move this over fairly far, and then move it down so that this right leg is touching the ground but is not bent. And then I'm going to grab the left leg and move it over again so it's up. I want this to translate Y value to be 0, but I also want this to be over far enough so that the leg's completely straight and the foot's still on the ground, which is about right here. Okay, so I go from here to here. Then at frame 32, which is the final frame, this foot is the same, but I'll go ahead and grab all my controls again and get rid of the root control. Key everything, but then move this over that same amount. So let's take a look at what this foot is at. It is at 34.925. So this foot I want to be at 34.925, or pretty close to 35. And then the hips I also want to be at 34.925. So now everything is centered back where it was, just everything's shifted over. I'll put the hips at 0 now so that they are standing straight up. So I go from here to here, my last pose. But in between, I'm doing this nice side step action. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit more to make it more interesting. For one thing, I want those legs to lift up when they leave the ground. So at frame 8, I'm going to grab this foot, move it up in the air like it's stepping, and then rotate it a little bit so that the knee is leading that action. I'm then also going to rotate the hips, the shoulders, and then all the way up the chain. I'm just rotating these back a little bit so that that foot is leading the action. So we'll get here. And then with this one, this other foot, I want at frame 24, this one also to be up in the air. And this time I'm going to rotate this back so we have a nice view of the leg that's bent. And now let's see what it looks like. Now the one problem I'm having is with this right here. I actually want to copy this over to here and then rotate it a little bit further. Let's see how that looks. And that's going really fast. So I'm going to right click on my timeline, playback speed, and make sure it's on real time. That way I get an idea for the actual speed rather than drag this over so that I can see just the part that's being animated. And that looks okay. Again, I can adjust the speed, the timing of this animation quite a bit. It is moving a little bit slowly. So if I wanted to, I could grab this and then just move everything over a little bit. Let's see how it looks if I move these over and do it in about half the time. So I do it in about half a second. And that may be too fast. That is quite quick. So it's somewhere in between. Maybe around um, 16, so that would be every 4 frames or so. So at 1, 5, 9, 13, and 16. And that feels a bit more natural. Okay, so that's all set up. I can go in here and clean up the action a little bit. Let's go ahead and set a key on that. I'm going to go ahead and set keys on everything just by clicking on the frame I want, hitting S, 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 S. Okay. So now we have a decent side step. It takes a little less than a second. You can make it about a second, probably would work as well. But let's go just briefly into the graph editor and see how this is working. So I'll go to Windows, Animation Editor, and Graph Editor. And go through this just one by one. So this, it looks fine. It's just translating over to constant speed. The translate Y, however, looks a little bit weird. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to grab this. These are all, everything's in linear mode, which I don't necessarily want. So I'm going to select all my curves, shift to double click on the timeline, right click, go to tangents and auto, and it'll change the way these things look. So now I want to grab my hips again and look at that translate Y value. And then any of these rotation values, and just make sure the curves are clean on that. Same here. I'm just going up the joint chain and just checking these. This is a little weird. So I'm going to go ahead and move this up a little. The same thing with the feet. I want those to move fairly nicely, and it looks like they are. Pretty good. I'm just looking for any weird shapes in these curves, which I don't see any, so I'll now play through again with that auto tangent on, and that's working a bit better. Again, that's a fairly quick side step. I'd go somewhere between 16 to 32 frames between your first and your last pose. I'll let you decide how you want to time that out, but it should be somewhere between those. So 16 is on the fast side, 32 is a little bit on the slow side. Somewhere around 24 frames is probably right about where the average would be. So if I moved this last frame to frame 25, and then this one now this middle one becomes frame 13. This one becomes frame 7. This one 19. Okay. So now I watch that, and that's pretty close to the correct timing that you would have for just a normal side step that you're not rushing. Okay. So that's all the information that you need. So just as a recap, be able to set up FK and IK joints. So an FK spine, an IK legs. Be able to set up the control curves for those. So all of those can be circles. They don't need to be anything fancy in this case. And then create parent-child and constraint relationships between the different elements to be able to control the geometry with the joints and the joints with the curves. So typically what we have is a parent-child relationship between the curves, and then also with the IK handles. A parent constraint relationship between the curves and the joints and the geometry. So the curves are controlling the joints and the joints are controlling the geometry. So if I move the curves, it will also control the geometry. And then be able to animate this basic sidestep animation. Very similar to what I just did. So you're just stepping over to the side with just a few basic keyframes. So start out with just your character standing up straight in the default pose. Do a middle pose where you move that character over, drop the hips a little bit, and spread out the legs to get it over a distance, and then end on a pose. This default pose just moved over to this other space, to the screen right or to the character's left. Add in some in-betweens to lift the legs or the feet up off the ground, and then just do a little bit of polish to make sure everything's working properly, and time it out. So again, it's somewhere between 16 to 32 frames that the side step takes. The overall animation can be a little bit longer, but around that 16 to 32 frames will work out pretty well. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.